what it was Monday. I was at the therapy centre, and I was talking to Grant Smith, who used to run it, and I said, I'm coming here to talk about local history, and I'm going to start right at the beginning with the Ice Age, 300 million years ago. Always said you want to start before that. Start with the Big Bang, that's 1 billion years ago. I said, well, I don't know much about the Big Bang. Not that we know much about the Ice Age. But it was my own particular thoughts about the Ice Age and the pile. The pile's so flat that what I imagined was during the Ice Age, as soon as the ice started to melt, you've got these big ice flows slowly moving across the pile towards the sea. And as the ice flows, which kept onto stones in bits of rock, as that met the sea, so the salt water would melt the edge of the ice flow, and that way we'd end up with the shingle bank along the front, all the way along, which I always regard as a defining boundary. Now the boundary is shifted about in the pile tremendously. As sand moved and vegetation and trees moved, you've got this guy, Ptolemy, all the spelling is spelled P-T-O-L-G or something. And he was one of the early keep close to that. He was one of the early map cartographer, what do you call him?
Cartographer. Just come down as you come past here.
Education's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Anyway, when he drew his map was about 2 miles out from what it is now, like at the low water mark. And sure enough, when we look through the history of the estuary of the Ribble, in the middle of, just the other side of the Ribble, was a huge bank called Crusader Bank. And from all accounts, they had pasture on there, and animals were grazing right in the middle of the estuary. But times change, and the early characters, Peter would know them, they were talking about in the very early days, were called the Wattentecks. The Wattentecks wandered around in the marshes and all sorts of places. They were carrying spears, and when they met fellow Wattentecks, their greeting was to touch the tip of the spears together. And I thought to myself, the young people today are doing that sort of thing. When the young people meet, they're putting hands up and touching like that, you see. So anyway, I'm prattling on. Are you putting me in the darkness? Good. There's something up there. About the year 685. I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning because I was worried about how I got the date right of when St. Cuthbert's body in his coffin first arrived around here. St. Cuthbert was a very well-respected saint. He used to talk to the birds and the animals and all this sort of thing. There's a click here. I'm supposed to switch this thing on. Click that on. Don't know what would that going on. That's it. Buzz. So the crowd who were looking after the monks, who were looking after St. Cuthbert's body, he died about just before 685, based at Durham, lived his farm over at Durham. And the Benedictine monks, they took it in turns to look after his body because they were all worried about the Danish invasion and they didn't want the Danes getting hold of the body of St. Cuthbert. And eventually they came to Lytham and they put this coffin down by the cricket ground there, and that's where you sit the cross. And things really started going on from there. The land was owned by this chap, Richard Fitzroger. He came from Wood Plumpton, and to this day I'm not quite sure where Wood Plumpton is, but nonetheless he was based at Wood Plumpton, and he also owned the lands go to this tiny little church of St Cuthbert, and he studied the teachings of St Cuthbert, and he experienced 2 miracles. So what he did, he decided to go to Durham and talk to them over at Durham and Lindisfarne, and he said, look, what I'm going to do, because of these miracles I've experienced, I'm going to give you all the lands in Lytham. And so it was after that that these Benedictine monks came along and created a cell at Lytham, which went, different lots came on, and that went on for hundreds of years. Very clever people, these Benedictine monks. They were on the land that is now the Lytham Hall Park, and they dug out the pond, bred fish in there, and so they've got a diet of freshwater fish. The land that came out of the pond, I'm prattling on too much, I'll get to that in a minute. The soil that they got out of the pit, they built the mound, they hollowed out the mound, and that acted as a refrigerator based on the absorption principle, so they kept all the meat in there. And then when they built the mound, they put on top of that one of the first windmills to be seen in Europe, a peg mill, for obviously grinding corn. Now, this area was really called a mountainous. It stretched not only the mile, but it went on a bit further back on there. And when we analyse the name, a mountainous, part of that name it got distorted. Ac meant oak, and mounder meant caring, and ness, of course, was a promontory, the way that the file juts out into the sea. And so, according to Porter, who wrote the history of the file, we had loads of oak trees all the way around the back here, which is really surprising because when you go out at the back and you're looking at the soil at the back, it's absolutely black, isn't it? And sometimes when you're going out of the back of Blackburn and you look at the lands that have just been freshly ploughed, you can see evidence of bog oak coming up to the surface. Well, the friars carried on quite nicely until we're getting to about 1532. The friars and prior Benedictine monks, they were having terrible trouble with a family coming in from Leighton, Butler family, and they were absolute thugs. They tore down the cross, they disputed the boundary. The correct boundary, as far as we're concerned, between Lytham and Leighton and Mars, is the ditch alongside Division Lane, which on the early maps is called the Prior's Ditch. Well, they didn't think that was the correct boundary. They really believed that they owned far more land and caused a whole load of trouble. And so battles pursued, and so, but around about that time, about 1532, we had Henry VIII on the throne. Now, Henry VIII was not only running short of money, but he wanted a divorce. And he thought the only way is to get rid of the Catholics. There was nothing wrong with them, very nice people. But so he went round all the monasteries and dissolved them. And he put his own Anglican church was established. Not only did that, he grabbed hold of all the lands, and if there's anything valuable about his lot grabbed it. And not only that, when his men came to Lytham, the Benedictine cell here, St Cuthbert's cell, he obviously got rid of the monks. They cleared off and went back to Durham. But he said, right, I'm taking over this church. This church from now on will be Anglican. Not only that, because I'm short of money, I'm not going to maintain this church. I'm going to establish a system called Chancellery Repair. Now, all of a sudden today, when you go and buy or sell a house round here, all of a sudden, Chancellery Repair has reared its head up. And the land registry are swamped with work on it. The solicitors don't understand it all. And it all stems back to the days of Henry VIII. That was about 1533, something like that. And so my son has just bought a house in Lytham. He's deserted St Anne's. Anyway, that's another story. He's gone to live in Lytham. And suddenly he's found that he's faced with the possibility of a Chancellery Repair looming, where it involved the number of houses, dwellings in Lytham amounts to 5,725. And St Cuthbert's Church had to register all this before June of 2013 to the land registry. And the land registry was saying, we don't know how we're going to handle all this, but handle it they have to. Anyway, I'm prattling on. We've done that. Oh yes, the next big event to come. I'll get to the slides in a minute, John, don't worry. The next big event was after Henry VIII came Queen Elizabeth I. Well, she really wanted to protect her navy, and she was appalled at the thought that we had all these storms which had absolutely devastated and knocked the oak trees down. So she had a word with their advisors and said, right, my advisors, what can you advise? And they said, marram grass. She said, what do you mean, marram grass? They said, well, you go to the coast, you create sand hills, and you plant marram grass in, lime grass, if you can find any of that. And you bring out a law such that all these people living in thatched cottages, whatever, must not touch any of the marram grass. And sure enough, the marram grass developed the sand dunes. And to this day, they've afforded great protection to us. Over 90% of the sand dunes in Lancashire are actually on the coast of St Anne's. We ignore those on the Southport side, that is in the area of Sefton. Could never understand that, it's something to do with Liverpool. And so that worked. And the action of being able to protect our lands turned the fields into pastures. And before you knew where you were, you had people like Cartwell's farm in the middle of what is now the airport, planting corn and barley, and the grasses themselves caught the blowing sands, because if you've ever seen the blowing sands, when it gets up there, it's actually blowing over the top of the sand hills. And as the sand was blowing inland, so the level of the ground rose. And if, for instance, you were driving along Queensway, round the back of the airport, if you look over to the left, you can see that land is so much higher. And you look over to the moss, where that's lower, that's where they want to build houses, but that's another story. So I'll quickly move on to about 1719, December 1917. That's about the Lytham flood. Terrible. Just before it happened, there was two characters. It's in this book, Lytham by Ed Ashton. There were two characters fishing in their boat, and they looked and they could see a storm burning out at sea. They said, hey, look, we better get to shore. One of the chaps, he was a servant at Lytham Hall, he went to the hall. The other chap went to a little thatched cottage at the back of Lytham. And then the storm started. And it destroyed a lot of cottages, a lot of people were killed. This chap who went back to his cottage, the main beam dislodged, and the main beam fell on his wife, killed his wife. He had his little baby, newborn baby, and he was so sick when he tried to come out of the cottage, it was flooded all around. There was no way he could get any help. So he's so fed up that what he did, he said, right, I'm clearing up back, I'll go to America. So he went off to America with his little baby, and of course the little baby grows up, the little baby has a child, and now that child, now the man's grandson, he said, right, we're all going back to Lytham, and we'll have you baptised at St Cuthbert's Church to remember the flood. But the spin-off from the flood, so much money came in that the people who lived, the trustees of this money didn't know what to do with it. They bought a whole load of land in Blackpool around what is now Church Street and didn't do anything with it for ages until we needed some schools. And then they said, right, we need more schools, the population's got up, we'll use that money, the income from that money, to build King Edward School, and then they still had money left over, and they built Queen Mary's School for the education of the needy of Lytham. And what a good thing that was. Now, I've got to deal now with these clips. They're just still pictures from the film we made in about 1975 of 100 years of St. Anne's. We start up there. There you are. That's Elijah Hargreaves, this bloke, and that's Thomas Fair. Thomas Fair was the estate agent, and Elijah Hargreaves and all these chaps from the Rosendale Valley, they were. What am I doing?
You can see it there.
Oh, that's amazing. There you go. That turned out. Isn't that good? You can see that. Yes. So Elijah Hargreaves and all these well-to-do people, they said we're interested in renting a square mile of this land, and we'll develop it and lay it out. And Thomas Fair, he said, I've already got a plan. You're thinking along our lines. Here's the plan. Just go and get some money, develop it, and the rents that you get in, obviously there's so much money for Squire Clifton so that he can carry on living the good life, you see. So, sure enough, next clip, like all businesses, they have to raise £50,000 in capital with 10,000 shares. So Rosendale Valley was such a well-to-do area. You've got the people like Mr. Porritt, who'd got the Sunnybank mill there in Hazelton, which was the largest spinning mill in Europe. Fantastic wealth. So all these wealthy people, and also they didn't like their children growing up in these dirty mill towns. So they thought, right, we'll get our children in private schools around St. Anne's, Newtown, and they'll be healthy, and we'll build some fantastic houses. And next, John. And so they all met in the Queen's Hotel in Rawtenstall. And they all agreed, yes, come on, that's what we'll do. We'll rent this square mile. This square mile, it went one way to St. Thomas's Road, the other way to St. Leonard's Road, and then it went back to Hedgergate Road and back to the middle of Church Road. So everything was established. Okay, John, next one. So the work started. And down to get the first houses in, obviously they had to move some sand dunes, which if I was living at the time, I would have been absolutely appalled at. I would have said, hey, you destroyed our sea defences. But coming from the Rosendale Valley, they didn't seem to understand anything about sea defences, and they just got stuck straight into the sand dunes, ignoring the laws of not to take any marine grass that way at all, and started creating. They established working huts for all these builders to live in very primitive conditions. Next one, and you'll see evidence of railway lines. by this time the railway had come. The railway came about 1840. St Anne's line was about 1860. And so all the materials were coming into this area, and they just laid down railway lines and brought the materials in. They had earth moving equipment, which all came along on the railway lines. Next one, education. Education in St Anne's was this building on Hay Houses Lane. But quickly the population started to grow, and so they then needed another school, which was created by the parish church. A little bit of a note about this time that I pulled up. It's easier for me to read. During the 19th century, Britain was transformed by the Industrial Revolution, and in 1801, at the time of the first census, only about 20% of the population lived in towns. By 1851, the figure had risen to 50%, and by 1881, about 2/3 of the population lived in towns. Now, all this was to do with the industrialisation. What was happening, I'm digressing here, a whole load of flour was coming in from America, and the local farmers around here just couldn't make a go of it. They had to pay so much percentage of their earnings to Squire Clifton, and in the end, the farming communities thought, right, we can make more money by going and working in the towns and working in the cotton mills, and that's what a lot of them did. The note, and as this area developed, and these guys from the Rosendale area set up on fixed rentals, they were on a fixed rental for 999 years. That's long enough for you, Peter, isn't it? Yeah, you know, on something like £5 a year. And what the Squire Clifton didn't realise was, at the time that the leases were granted, about 1875 onwards, £5 was probably a lot of money. But as time went on, £5 was nothing. And I'm saying that brought about the close of the Squire Clifton's wealth. The family didn't have as much money to spend, but even though they didn't have much money to spend, their income was declining. They still carried on high living. But that's another story. So next one, that's William Porritt. He's a chap who had a huge mill. Not only did he have a mill, he had a stone quarry up on the hills by Helmshaw. I've been round there. The little railway line goes right up to the top of the hills, and then they mined this beautiful stone that the Porritt houses were built on. And of course they got the railway system, so they could bring this stone, and they cut a lot of the stone on site there, and William Porritt built all those fantastic, next slide, all those fantastic houses on the promenade. This shop, that was probably about 1880, before on the crescent looking down, before the Catholic Star of the Sea Church was built. Over on the left, this is looking down to St Anne's Road East. On the left was just barren land, and in 1894, that land, the garden, we call them the Crescent Gardens, were developed to remember the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. But I could talk for ages about that. Next slide, John. That was the early development of the pier. A huge success when it opened. Steamers, in those days, early 1900s, paddle steamers could come to the end of the pier. And from the end of the pier, they could go off to places like Llandudno. And it was only about a year ago I was talking to Amanda, maiden name Clark. She was part of the Clark family. And I said, have you got any interesting old documents? She said, yes, we've got a bill of lading, I think they call it, where a flock of sheep was brought to the end of the pier. And the flock of sheep was brought into the St. Anne's, destined for one of the farm. Hello, Nick, come and sit down. And so next slide. Those are some of the fine porrick houses that went up. They were all built to a tremendously high standard. Only the very best of people lived in those houses. Very elite area. That was South Promenade. The gardens hadn't been developed. You can see the rough land in front. Next slide, John. And there are education. That is now the district club. But in those days, it was a boys' school called the Kilgrimmel Boys' School. Their playing field, which we called the Killy, was down St Thomas's Road. Go over the bridge down towards Church Road, there was all the playing fields on the left-hand side. And when the school eventually closed down, which I think was probably in the 30s, the local amounts, there we'd inherited a football ground, which was wonderful for the local amounts. There, tucked away in the middle, is the old lifeboat house. Now, these people from the Rosendale Valley, inland people, they didn't realise the importance of having a lifeboat house on the front. They said a lifeboat house would lower the tone of the promenade. So they built it down in East Bank Road. Built by the... Hello, Ned.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course you can.
I found out that there was actually an old lighthouse somewhere around there.
Oh, there was. That was the end of Lightboat Avenue. You're quite right.
So did the tide come right up to where the hotels are?
Oh, not in those days, not in 1875. But prior to that, when they had the big storms, the tide used to come in up to Hayhouses Lane. That's a very important point there, yes. But once Queen Elizabeth got all these sand dunes in, and we managed to protect the land, so the land rose, and we were able to restore the coastline. But the dangers were absolutely horrific of our coast. Next slide, John. Here you are. You can imagine. There's a lighthouse. That was probably the Nora Boy. But they had to drag that when the moon went up. All the local people, like my granddad with his arm was shot, he had a horse. He had to run up down to the coast. The Whitesides taxi people, they had horses. There was a mad dash down to the front. They had to get the horses in the shafts of the lighthouse in East Bank Road, drag it out, the little bridge over a ditch, down that slope, the slope is there still, to the car park along Salter's Wall, down that slope and straight into the sea. Terrifying. Next slide, John. So 1886, that's the bar to Mexico. It was carrying a cargo of swords, but it got into difficulty in a huge storm in the river estuary. It banged up against the bank, sandbank, although and it being bumped on the bay, it was in danger of completely breaking up. And the Southport Voluntary Lifeboat Block went down, Lytham Lifeboat went down, St Anne's Lifeboat went down. All the crew of the St Anne's Lifeboat were lost. It was a terrible disaster, which we're still remembering to this day. Next slide, John. And so that's why we've got the Lifeboat Memorial up there to remember all those people that lost their lives. Along North Promenade was Mr. McCarthy. He was a very well-to-do businessman in Manchester. he and all the rest of them were so upset. He said, look, we're going to start Lifeboat Saturday. And we started Lifeboat Saturday, which is recognised throughout the country now. And they raised a lot of money. And of course, even though our existing crew were all drowned, straight away more volunteers came to replace it, and the next boat that came along was the Mill Report. Next slide, John. Now here's the front at St Anne's. They've taken away the sand dunes, so they thought, how can we protect it? And this is an amazing picture, because what they did, they created a slope for a seawall, then they brought in from Ulverston limestone blocks, those square blocks, and set them into the sand. And you can still see those blocks today. And that formed the seawall. But that wasn't enough at all, because the sands still blew along over the promenade gardens and all the rest of it. So after that, in later views, you'll see the sand shields, cast iron sand shields that we put along the front of the promenade. They're curved at the top in such a way that when the wind hits it, it's curled at the top and it kills the sand and brings the sand back down onto the beach. Next slide, John. They thought they were doing such a good job. Here are the leading William Pollock, 1894, digging the first drains. And he said, right, we're putting these really fancy drains in, but we only want you to use these drains for rainwater. Don't start putting any soil down. So of course there you are, the drain pipe were duly laid. The first drain pipe came out alongside St Anne's Pier. And next slide, John. Let me just finish about the pier. And before where you were, even though the ground landlords, the St Anne's Land and Building Company, had laid on a vehicle with a big panel on to come round and empty your pretty bucket, they started putting soil down. So at the end of St Anne's Pier, there used to be, you'll see early photographs of people cockling there, like the Melon family used to gather cockles up the end of St Anne's Pier. Reading in the minutes at the St Anne's Library about what was happening at that time. The instruction went out to the Melon family and other fishermen, raking away the cockle. Stop cockling. Stop hurting anybody. That pipe that's coming out at the end of the pier is polluting the cockle bed, which is right at the end of the pier. So there we go. Disasters are the drainage scheme, and even today we're having terrible problems with our drains. They should have separate rainwater drains to soil drains, and all the rainwater could have just gone out to sea fine. They could also have diverted around St Anne's, where we've got sand in our underneath us. They could have just created soakaways. But we only need a big downfall of rain around here, and we just can't control it. Now, here we are. The bicycles arrived, penny farthing. The fact about the bicycle, the penny farthing, the early cycling clubs were responsible for improving the roads throughout the country. Of course, you remember cycling along, you hit a pothole through today, shakes the living daylights out of you. And that's why your early bikes were the penny farthing bicycles with the big wheel on. It was the big wheel that could handle the small potholes. Next slide. Here is our first fire pump. A beautiful thing, all red and grass, horse-drawn, and when the alarm went up, they'd couple the horse up. Very cruel they were, these firemen. They put a hot potato And after the film, an old St. Anne's fellow came up to him. He said, "Do you know what happened to that fire pump, that glorious fire pump?" We said, "No." Well, he said, "Do you remember the gas on it is down St. David's Road North?" We said, "Yes." Well, when they moved the gasometers away, there was a big hole. And they tipped that really beautiful fire pump down the hole. And now, of course, you've got St. David's Grove. The houses have been built over where the gasometer is. I wonder how many of those people realise that they're living above the old fire pump. Next one, John. Oh, the age of gas. Virtually, well, when the gas arrived, gradually all the houses went on to gas lighting. All down Church Road they had gas lighting. And I can always remember talking to one gas engineer, we called him Popeye. He had an accident. As a child, he hurt his eye. But I said, "How are you getting on?" Oh, he said, "It's strange." He said, "I've just been in a house down Church Road. We're having a look round this house, all gas, no electricity. But they had a mains-driven radio going in the house." And he said, "I hope you don't mind me mentioning it. You're all gas. How are you running a mains electric radio?" Oh, he said, "Don't say anything. We've drilled a hole in our skirting board, lined up with next door's electric plug. And we've tapped into the back of it. Yes. Next slide. Yes, that was the Kilburn Old Boys School down the district club with a wonderful bowling green behind. I don't think ladies are allowed down below now. The ladies have got a bridge club up above. And I think John, back there, he's a member of the club. Next one. That's the United Reformed Church Hall, alongside Ashton Gardens. Beautiful, beautiful church. And when the people from the Rosendale Valley came to this area, a lot of them were Methodists, United Reformed people, Baptists, and so suddenly they got all these beautiful churches going on, marvellous. The vicar at St Cuthbert's Church didn't like it. He thought they shouldn't happen at all. He felt that he controlled rhythm, he controlled everything that was going on. But the squire of Clifton said, no, it's all right. Let them build your Baptist church, Methodist churches. Perfect, all right. Next slide, John. There's a magnificent St Anne's Hotel. The first golf course, the first St Anne's on the Sea golf course was on land just at the back, across the railway from the St Anne's Hotel. It was all open fields, they had corn growing and all the rest of it. And the first St Anne's at the end of the 1800s, golf course was created there, a huge golf course, running just behind the houses in St Anne's Road East, where Glenelg Road is and Mills Road and all the rest of it. And the golfers, because they were sort of sharing public open space in farmers' fields in those days, they all had to wear red coats because they were dangerous. Anyone banging a golf ball about was dangerous. So they met upstairs in oak-panelled rooms, all la-di-da up there, the golfers. But below there, and that place is built, the first hotel to be built in St Anne's, in March of 1875. Below there is a marvellous long bar of all made of Minton tiles, the finest Minton tile bar in Europe. Beautiful bar. And it got the name of Rat Pit. Not because the people going in there were horrible people. It was because the rat people were the golf caddies Anyone who was a golf caddy in those days was called a ratter. And they had to do their drinking down below, and the golfers did their drinking upstairs. Next slide. Oh, the tram. That arrived at the end of the 1800s. But there you are. That was a gas tram. Horrible things. Running on, resupplied the gas, sometimes created the gas. And the gas was a derivative of coal. And that was to power an internal combustion engine, and you can imagine that the engines carboned up very quickly. They were forever stripping the engine down, taking side valve engines, taking the tops off, and decoking them. And not only that, opposite where Fountains used to be was a huge sand hill, and the sand used to come across the track, and that four-wheel thing would run off the rails. And everybody had to get back off the tram and push the tram back on the rail, and it would carry on up to Lytham. Lytham behind Henry Street was a gas filling place. It ended up being a territorial hall, but that was the gas filling place at Lytham. Next slide. And then later on came electricity. Wonderful. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the land occupied by the tramway was in good condition. Either side was just rough ground on Clifton Drive. The people, sometimes land and building company, Squire Clifton, they insisted that the tramway company had to maintain the tram roadway to very good condition. So what happens, all the cyclists would cycle on the tram track, would avoid the road, so they had to quickly avoid the tram when it was coming along. Next one, John. The garden started to be laid out with a magnificent bandstand near the pier. James Pullman's son did a lot of work with the rockery there. He used to create rockery from bits of white limestone that had come from the behind Grange. And by molding it, he could mold it into shapes that looked like rockery. And he created that waterfall in the Promenade Garden. And that's all handmade rockery, but he did it so convincingly. Next slide, John. The pier and the Moorish Pavilion. Moorish Pavilion held 1,000-seater. And this side was the floral hall where Arnold Sumner and all those people had that wonderful orchestra. So popular with the visitors and the residents. It was Saturday and Sunday all dressed up in the best. Next slide. That's Claude White's plane. 1909, October 1909. The first fully recognised air display in the whole of the United Kingdom was on St Anne's Land. Don't believe that lot from Blackpool. Blackpool would be convinced that it was the Blackpool Air Show. It was a St Anne's Air Show. It was on Squire Clifton's land, where Squire Clifton had his race course. So that all came about because earlier in the year, in about July, over at Reims, just outside Paris, there was an air show going on there. And the Blackpool councillors, give them the due, money making, they said, hey, will you come and bring the air show to St Anne's? They said, yes, a lot of money in it, competitions and all the rest of it. So Claude White came along, on a whole load of early aviators, very dangerous machines, tied together with bits of wire and bicycle wheels. A.V. Rowe, Elliot Vernon Rowe, came along. He built his early plane at Brownsfield Mill in Manchester, in the basement there. And he had no money at all. He was subsidised by his brother, who was making braces higher up in the mill. So he came along to Blackpool in October 1909. He couldn't even afford linen to cover his wings. He covered his wings in brown paper. everything would have been all right, but it rained. And it couldn't get off the ground. This Claude White fella, a brilliant chap, he got airborne, and he took a message from the mayor of Blackpool to the mayor of Southport, landing on Southport Beach. And he was the first person to start airmail in the world. There you are. Brilliant. And that started in St Anne's, in Firewood, with it. Yes. Where am I up to, John? Come on, next slide. Carlton's Cosy Corner. Well, there you are, they set that up opposite Langdon Avenue. It tucked away in the sandhills. We called it Happy Valley. And they had the Piero shows on there. And of course they had the talent competitions right opposite Lord Ashton's bungalow, which was up on the top of a sandhill, corner of Cartmel Road and Promenade. And you had people like the young, she was only about 15 at the time, Gracie Fields went up on the stage there. She was suffering from a terrible chest infection. She was at the Rochdale convalescent home. But as she was getting better, she would go along to Happy Valley and go into the talent competitions. Next slide. First World War comes out. And there they are, all the volunteers and you look at in front of the bandstand, the pier in the background, all getting ready, doing a physical training to go off to that terrible Great War. Slide, next one, John. This house was typical of the houses that were building about that time. And I always imagine going up and standing on the top of that house, you'd have a marvellous view all around St Anne's. Next slide, John. An early shot of Ashton Gardens. You see that sort of overmantel over the top of the gates. Magnificent structure. The supporters of Ashton Gardens are hoping to raise enough money to build another overmantel like that. St George's entrance of Ashton Gardens. But, later on when the Second World War came out, they wanted iron, and that was one of the first things to go, oh, chop it down, melt it down for bombs. And all the railings and your sort all around St Anne's. Beautiful cast iron work, just cut down and melted down for bombs. Next slide, John. The War Memorial Hospital. That used to be, hey, we've got a bus going on here. Where's that coming from, John? Is it your fault?
It's the heater.
Oh, it's all right, I'll carry on. That used to be the home of the Bannister family. It would have been the 20s, I think. We were desperate for a hospital for St Anne's. Lytham had the hospital. We hadn't got anything. And so they were striving to raise the money to buy it. I think in those days it cost something like £10,000. And in the end, Lord Ashton came forward and said, I'll buy that for you. And sure enough, he did. But it was one thing buying the hospital, it was another thing running it. So every year, around about July, we had our hospital fete days. Marvellous fete days. And the fete day and other charitable things around town kept that hospital going. Next slide, John. I think this is about 1922, May 1922, when Lytham joined to St Anne's. St Anne's joined Lytham.
Correct.
Well, of course, there you are. Historians will always argue with one another. I would argue that St Anne's, we generated our own electricity. 210 volts DC. You could charge up your own wireless 2-volt accumulators straight from the major, couple them all up together in a row. And if you had enough in a row, you could charge a battery straight from the main using resistor bulbs. So that's another story. But there you are, we had electricity. Lytham needed electricity, they were just on gas. So they gave me the impression that Lytham were taking over St Anne's, as David would say. But as soon as he joined up, sometimes the electricity cables were going into Liver. Next one, of course, here are the Empire Cinema, now gone, but that together with the Palace Cinema was great entertainment. Next one, they started off as Imperial Hotel, and they changed the name to the Majestic later on, and then it wouldn't get mixed up with the Imperial Blackfield. And people would come to have brine baths, and down in the basement we'd have these baths filled up with salt water, supplied by the pier company, because the pier company had the rights on the side, and the man at the pier would charge them £1 a bucket to pour into these posh people's baths. Go on, next one, John. Believe it or not, this is in the beginning of the 30s. And if you study it carefully, building the promenade at St Anne's, they laid these railway tracks down. That one, sort of an inland bit, just round the boating group, that went along the ledge, and today you can still see that ledge where that railway line went along. That railway line went down onto the sands, right up to Squires Gate, where they picked up the gravel off the beach, brought it back up a rickety wooden gantry, right along there to the gravel works, where the vintage tennis cafe is now, where it used to crunch all the gravel up. Then it would come back, mixed up as concrete, and that was being used to build the promenade. Next slide. You wondered why they stopped the trams. And here you are. This would be about opposite Pontins or the holiday camp. The sound had come streaming across. One of the reasons why the sound, we blame it on that air show of 1909. When that air show was on, 200,000 people came. They wouldn't pay to go and watch it on the ground. They all stood on the sandhills and jumped up and down on the marrow grass and killed them. And so it was on the work of volunteers planting new marrow grass in that we managed to stabilise the sound. Next thing, John. There there's an idea. Back from 1935. The price of houses. That's in Church Road, near Haymarket. You can buy a house from £495. Next slide. That's Whiteside's garage. Temple Fire, just off Park Road. He used to have his taxi business there. He was also the main Ford agent in St Anne's. Next slide. Second World War breaks out. Next slide. After the war, that didn't take long, did it? After the war, that's Winston Churchill coming out of the Majestic Hotel. He used to stay there. Next slide. George Formby, marvellous character. My father got that programme. My father went down to see George Formby singing at the Palladium and picked up that programme that's been copied so many times. George Formby used to, he had numbers of houses. He had one house, as you well know, Berrowby, on the promenade near to King Edward Avenue. I could go on all day talking about that chap. It turned out nice again was his favourite expression. Turned out nice again, and other common expressions. Next one, John. I'm watching the time. I've got the clock in front of me. Oh, Joseph Locke. He managed to escape to Ireland to get away from the taxman. He lived down St Anne's Road East, and he would appear on St Anne's Pier, and he would come along to the open air baths on Gala Day, and so would George Formby. Next slide. Here, this is when Gabriel Harrison came along and took over from the Pier Company, the St Anne's Land and Building Company. Gabriel Harrison is in the middle there. Mr. Prince is, to the left. He came from Islington. He was a secretary and solicitor. And there they've got the wheelbarrow, ebony and silver, that was used in the cutting of the first turf for the drainage in 1894 or thereabouts, 96. Next slide, golf championship with, you see, marvellous. We've got some of the world's best golf courses here, the Royal Livingston Downs. Next, St John's Open Air Pool. When St John's Open Air Pool first opened, in June of 1916, in the middle of the First World War. Incredible to think that they built that pool then. And that pool was owned by, Mrs. Astley, wife of the local MP. And she said, in her speech, she said, you know, this pool, at that time, was the finest open air pool in the United Kingdom. It held 1 million gallons of filtered seawater. Okay, it was taken in from a pipe that ran straight out on the beach into settling tanks, filtration, all that. A wonderful pool. Next, John, Carnival Day. You see, hospital fate no longer needed national health, and so we have the Carnival Day. Next, John, and then we have the centenary of St Anne's, 1974. These medals were issued. Next, John, I've only got about 3 minutes left. We have the Yehudi Menuhin concert. And here is Princess Anne coming along in 1974, alongside Gabriel Harrison. You were not allowed to follow royalty with a cine camera. So Peter Wilson, who was making the overall film, The Chapel of Sam, he said, here, Arnold, here's one cine camera. You film Princess Anne coming to the entrance of the pier. So that's what he did. And then he filmed her coming all the way up the pier. And I got my dinner jacket underneath my coat. And I thought, I can't hang around like this. I want to see this concert. But it cost £25 to see this magnificent concert. And so I started walking down the pier and got my camera case. And I got stopped by the security people who said, great big fellas, where do you think you're going to? I said, the microphone is broken down backstage and I'm going to fix it. Oh, carry on. So I went in the stage door at the back. And there was Peter Wilson, you know, stage manager, you know. And Peter said, be quiet, Arnold, just sit down there on that chair and behave yourself. So I sat down on the chair, and the orchestra was playing, you know, all the rest of it. And I got chatting to this lady who sat next to me. And she introduced herself as Hepzibah, Judy's sister. And she was telling me such a wonderful story about how they got out of Russia, they got to New York in 1926. Music was always in the family. Then they came to England, and you know, violin teaching and all the rest of it. And then she said, well, excuse me, I've got to go on and play the piano. So she started playing. Well, you know the piano, the wind was howling through the floorboards and blowing the music on. One of the members of the orchestra came and grabbed over me. He said, well, you come and turn the pages of the music on. So I went on stage and there I was, sat on stage at Hepzibah, turning the music over. Well, you know I can't read music. So I said, I was chatting to her while she was playing, Princess Anne was just down there. I said, hang on. What are all these little bits that you've written in at the top in pencil? She said, that's in case the people turning the music over aren't turning the pages of the music over quick enough. So she kept on nodding down, turn the page over. So afterwards, I came up and I thought, I must get a programme. I've got a programme in here. I must have a programme. So I went down, in the interval, went down there. And the publicity manager of the town, in those days, Barry Morris, he got promotion, he went to Blackpool later on. And Barry said, oh, what were you doing up on the stage with Epsilon? I said, well, don't tell anybody. But her upstage hand was injured, and I was playing the left hand. Hey, I'm talking too much. Go next slide, John. We're nearly time's up. Oh, the fire. There are the fire. Oh, got burnt down. Next slide. Terrible that. Next slide. There's the shell. Burnt out here. Tragedy. Next slide, John. The Ashton Theatre. That burnt down and they were, was it your lot, Charlie girl? Hey, you're got burnt down there on their parish church operatic society. Yeah, the whole thing. Amazing, isn't it? Yeah. See, next slide, John, before Peter takes over. Here you have the Bible slide, look at that. Lord Ashton paid for that. It would cost millions. Pay for that now. Beautiful marble and the bronze statues made by a character called Marsden sculptures. And it was so famous that they got models of the sculpture work at the War Memorial Museum, War Museum in London. Right, it's now 12 o'clock. I'm told to shut up after an hour. So thank you very much for listening very carefully. John home, and then you can meet up with me later and ask me any questions you want.